In Hebrews 12, we're going to stay in Hebrews 12, and tonight we're just getting to the point in verses 18 through 24, where the writer of Hebrews has been talking about a new and living way, and he gives us the comparison between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, and it's very, very clear in that 12th chapter. If somebody wants to read verses 18 through 24 of Hebrews 12, we'll get started with that. I'm not going to go back over the things that we've been saying between the recordings, the notes, everything else. There's plenty there without me going over it. If you can just keep in your minds, I'll remind you weekly, if we just keep in our minds that the writer of Hebrews, when he's talking about a new and living way, he spends the better part of the book talking about the old way and the new way, the external and the internal, that the old way stressed the external, the new way is the internal, the natural and the spiritual. We talked about Upper and Lower Springs. There's so many different things, the law and religion, or relationship and love and that kind of thing. So there's a very, very clear, by the time we get to chapter 12, it's a bit of the peak, where the new and living way, he makes it clear the difference between the two. So Hebrews 12 verses 18 through 24, you have not come.
Okay. For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched, and that burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them any more, for they could not endure what was commanded. And if so much as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, in heavenly Jerusalem, to the innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel.
We've come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, he said, and that's really where we're going to start tonight, spend tonight, next week, this idea of Mount Zion. I don't know, obviously Carol years ago was touched by Mount Zion, and knows scriptures about Mount Zion and the daughter of Zion and that kind of thing. I don't know if anybody else in the room does, doesn't. If I was to ask, what do you think of when you think of Mount Zion? Anything that anybody wants to throw out? Now would be the time to do it. Mount Zion, what does it?
I don't know.
The word worship comes to mind? Okay.
Psalms 133 reference to, it was as if the dew of Hermon were to fall on Mount Zion. Because I was, being a torrential.
That's one of the references in the Psalms, which people think of. Again, the Psalm has to do with unity. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together. Which is one of the things we talked about with the reversions, that we revert back to parceling up the land, yours and mine. Whose camp are you in? Are you a charismatic Pentecostal? This kind of thing. But Psalm 133, which brings in the emphasis of Zion, also brings in the emphasis of unity. It's over with. We're not parceling up the land anymore. We are one. That's what Jesus prayed, that we would be one. It's absolutely amazing that he prayed we'd be one and we still keep dividing ourselves. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of nuts that he's brought us to Mount Zion. We were born. What's Psalm 133, like he said. So it's part of what we'll talk about a little bit, I guess. Anything else that people think when they think of Mount Zion?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Yeah. The daughter of Zion. That also refers to Jerusalem, right?
It's easy enough when we think of Mount Zion because it is a literal place. Okay? To like restrict it just to a place. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky because there's tons of references to Mount Zion in the Old Testament. Tons of references because it is a physical place. But it is like the New Jerusalem in Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem isn't really a place, it's the bride, isn't it? That's what we're told. So Jerusalem has a very physical, you can go there, you can visit it. You can go on a holiday and go to Israel and go to Jerusalem. You can go to Mount Zion. It's a physical place. But it has spiritual implications to it. We are not going to be looking at the natural place so much, where it is, on what side of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's built on Mount Zion, Mount Moriah. The physical is not the thing that we're interested in. Because the writer of Hebrews, that's the whole point. He takes them to Mount Sinai in a very physical capacity. He tells them, you were at you remember Mount Sinai? You could see it, you could smell it. He goes through all the physical manifestations of it. He says, but you've come to a spiritual place. You've come to Mount Zion. Yes, it is a physical place, but you've come to the spiritual Mount Zion. And as you read through the nature of Mount Zion, he brings in all different elements of the spiritual. He's not talking about the physical anymore. It's just like we as people are a combination of the physical and the spiritual. We tend to see the physical because our eyes are physical and see the physical. If we look around the room, we were to try to see someone's spirit, it's a much more difficult thing to do. Physically, we can see each other. Spiritual, but we know that we are one, spiritual and physical. Now, you might wonder, well, this book was written to the Hebrews, and here we are kind of like putting in a 21st century context. I want to say, when I talked about reversions, I made the comment, and I believe it, that we haven't transitioned and been transformed very well. Because during our transition process, when we should have been transitioning from the old to the new, we still revert back to the old. And I'm not going to go back to the old, to what I said last week. But the reason that this becomes so contemporary is because the church today acts more like the church of the Old Testament at Mount Sinai under the law, with do's and don'ts, with that whole thing, rather than being delivered out of that, led to Mount Sinai, as Mount Zion, to a spiritual place and all that means. So tonight I'm only going to share 3 things. Each word begins with an L, relatively simple. It's not going to be the history of Mount Zion. It's just going to be some passages about Mount Zion and what becomes clear. The first L word is the word liberty. Being set free from someplace, freedom to someplace. And we're going to take a couple of New Testament scriptures. We've already said very clearly that Zion is compared to Mount Sinai in Hebrews 12 when he says, you have not come here, you have come there. Galatians 4, I'm going to need people to read tonight, so if you've got your Bibles. Russ, would you go to Galatians 4? And Mark, do you have a Bible over there?
Yep.
Would you go to 2 Corinthians 3? Russ, in Galatians 4, would you read what Paul has to say in verses 21 through 27?
Tell me, you who want to be under law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. But the son of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son of the free woman through the promise. This is allegorically speaking, for these women are 2 covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother, for it is written, rejoice, barren woman who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For more are the children of the desolate than the one who has a husband.
In chapter 5, verse 1, just the first verse.
It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore keep standing firm. and did not be subject again to a yoke of slavery.
One more time, that verse one more time.
It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm, and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery.
The whole book of Galatians is about a church that was birthed in the Spirit. They knew they were birthed in the Spirit. Paul birthed them in the Spirit. And all of a sudden a group came in, they're called Judaizers, and they wanted to bring them back under the law and said, no, you've got to do this, and you got to do that, you got to do this. And Paul's making it clear, like we were saying over dinner tonight, you cannot go forward in the things of the Spirit if you want to go backwards and live under the law. If you want to revert and go back, you can't go forward. This is what Hebrews 12 is about. Paul says this in Galatians 4. He goes back to Mount Sinai. He says it's a place of slavery. It's a place of slavery. Do you understand that? You've been delivered from that. You've been set free from that so you can move forward to Mount Zion, worship God freely, live freely. That's one of the essences of Mount Zion. It's a place of freedom. Now, Paul quoted Isaiah 54 in that Galatians passage that Russ just read. A third of the references in the Old Testament to Zion are in Isaiah. Isaiah, like David, the two of them, have more to say about Zion. We'll talk next week about why David is so clued up. But this week, Isaiah's clued up because he's a prophet. He gets it. He actually gets it. He sees what God's plan was all along, what the old and the new was going to look like, what the tabernacle of Moses and the tabernacle of David, the law and legalism, love, grace. He saw all this and was like, whoa! Isaiah is very clued up about Zion. In 2 Corinthians 3, Paul has another passage that doesn't come right out necessarily and mention Sinai and Zion per se, but it brings it in a different context. Mark, would you read verses 3 through 6 in 2 Corinthians 3?
Clearly you are a letter from Christ showing the result of our ministry among you. This letter is not written with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It is carved not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. We are confident of all this because of our great trust in God through Christ.
So you could see again, there's a reference there to tablets of stone. You can't go any place but Mount Sinai to get those tablets of stone. And he says, but that's not what it's about anymore. You are actually the letters, and what was written on tablets of stone is now written on hearts. And Jeremiah said that, Ezekiel said it. It's in the Old Testament. We read that last week, or maybe it was Sunday morning we read it, I'm not sure. Anyway, we've read it recently, that it was prophesied. The prophets got this, that they would not be dragging around stone tablets anymore, but they would be carrying the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant was the presence of God among them. So they would be carrying the presence, but not like an ark and tablets of stone. They would have hearts that had been circumcised. They would have new hearts, born again, faith speaking from our hearts, and we would be traveling along. This was the new. This was Zion. This is what Zion is about. The Spirit. Paul's making it clear. This is 2 Corinthians. The Spirit. Would you continue verses 7 through 11?
The old way, with laws etched in stone, led to death, though it began with such glory that the people of Israel could not bear to look at Moses' face. For his face shone with the glory of God, even though the brightness was already fading away. Shouldn't we expect far greater glory under the new way, now that the Holy Spirit is given life? Yet the old way, which brings condemnation, was glorious. How much more glorious is the new way, which makes us right with God? In fact, the first glory was not glorious at all compared with the overwhelming glory of the new way. So if the old way, which has been replaced, was glorious, how much more glorious is the new, which remains forever?
Again, you can't miss what Paul's talking about, the old and the new way. He said it several times. And he's talking about the glory. He's not negating the fact that the glory of God shone round about them in the Old Testament. We read scriptures about the glory and the glory cloud in the temple, on the mountain. We read these scriptures. They're all in the Old Testament. There's a glory there, but then Paul says, but whatever glory that was, to be honest with you, was nothing compared to the glory that was revealed in his Son that now is in us. That's the glory that we were working towards all along. That was God's plan all along. Not that old glory where God visited us every so often, but a place that he would dwell in 24/7. And how much more glorious is that?